I retired from the United States Army at the rank of colonel after commanding Fort Drum for 6 years, and I'd spent 40 years in uniform serving my country. My wife Margaret and I had decided that upstate New York would be our sanctuary, a place far enough from military bases to feel like we were finally home, but close enough to remain involved in consulting work with the Pentagon on strategic operations planning. Hey everyone, welcome back to HOA Backdoor Stories. If you're new here, subscribe to the channel and hit that notification bell. Before we start, let me know in the comments what country are you watching from and what's your HOA horror story. Let's jump into today's episode. We'd purchased our property in Meadowbrook Heights 3 years prior, a beautiful 2.3-acre parcel with a 1970s farmhouse that needed updating but had good bones and tremendous potential. The neighborhood was quiet, established, with homes spread out enough that you didn't feel crowded, but not so isolated that you were completely removed from community. Most of our neighbors were retirees like us, young families with children, and a handful of professionals who worked remotely. It was exactly what we'd imagined during those long deployment years when Margaret would pull up images of peaceful New York properties on her laptop while we were stationed overseas. The housing restrictions were minimal. The HOA was more about maintaining the general aesthetic and ensuring nobody was running a junkyard on their property. Everyone seemed reasonable, and the annual fees were only $420, which I felt was entirely fair for road maintenance and the small community center. When we first arrived, I spent every weekend out on the land planning what we could do. Margaret loved the idea of a proper master suite with an attached sitting room where she could read and watch the birds on the property. I'd always wanted a decent workshop space, and the land gave us room to expand without creating an eyesore. We attended the HOA meetings, paid our dues on time, and tried to be the kind of neighbors who didn't create problems. Life was good, peaceful, exactly what we'd earned after decades of living in military housing with walls thin enough to hear your neighbor's alarm clock. Then Karen Mitchell became HOA president. She'd been on the board for 2 years as a general member, but when elections rolled around that spring, she campaigned aggressively, promising community standards and property value protection and accountability for every resident. She won with about 60% of the vote, which I later learned was the lowest voter turnout the community had ever seen. Karen worked in real estate marketing and had strong opinions about architecture, landscaping, and what she called the neighborhood narrative. I should have seen warning signs when, at her first board meeting as president, she proposed 17 new rules and policies, from the acceptable colors for mailboxes to the minimum size of front yard plants. But I thought it was just initial enthusiasm, something that would settle down once she realized how many actual complaints she'd need to process. I was wrong. Karen became obsessed with what she called architectural coherence, which essentially meant she wanted every property to look vaguely similar and well-maintained. She wasn't wrong about that desire in theory. Nobody wants to live next to someone's dumping ground, but her execution was something else entirely. That summer, I approached her about expanding our home. I'd done everything right. I'd consulted the HOA architectural guidelines, hired a licensed contractor I'd thoroughly vetted, created detailed plans with professional drawings, and filled out the formal application with specifications for materials, colors, and dimensions. The addition I planned was 600 square feet, a master suite with a small back deck, nothing ostentatious or outside the bounds of what other properties had done. I submitted the application in late July, and Karen reviewed it within 2 days. She sent me a handwritten note that I still have in my files. "Love the design. So glad to see our community growing thoughtfully. Clear sailing ahead. Karen." I was genuinely relieved. I'd expected detailed questions or possible requests for modifications, but instead I had enthusiastic approval. 3 weeks later, with permits from the county already secured and my contractor ready to break ground, I received a phone call on a Tuesday morning at 9:15. It was my contractor, Marcus, sounding frustrated and confused. Karen had appeared at the property unannounced and demanded he stop all work immediately. I drove over there myself within 20 minutes. Karen was standing in the driveway of my property, not on her own land, but on mine, photographing the foundation work with her phone. She had her hair pulled back tight, wore what I would later learn was her standard uniform of athletic wear that cost more than most people's monthly utility bills, and had the expression of someone who'd discovered a crime scene. "Colonel Barrett," she said, not looking up from her phone, "I'm afraid we have some serious problems here." I was respectful. I've spent my entire career navigating difficult personalities and high-pressure situations, so I kept my tone neutral. "Good morning, Karen. I have the board-approved architectural plans right here. The county permits are all in order. What concerns do you have?" She looked at me then, and I saw something in her eyes that I recognized from years of reading people. It wasn't genuine concern. It was power, or rather, the intoxicating feeling of wielding power over someone else. "The deck," she said, "is 3 feet too close to the property line. That's a violation of community standards and the architectural guidelines. Also, this color palette clashes significantly with the neighborhood aesthetic, and the window placement creates unacceptable privacy concerns." I walked the property line myself that afternoon with a surveyor. The deck was exactly where it was supposed to be, 8 feet from the property line, well within county and HOA regulations. The color scheme was standard cedar siding with a charcoal roof, both listed in the approved materials from Karen's own architectural guidelines document. The windows faced my backyard, which was surrounded by my own trees and, notably, had no neighboring properties with a direct sight line. I called Karen and suggested we meet to review the permits together. She refused, instead sending a certified letter the next day that changed everything. The certified letter arrived on August 22nd, and I still keep it in a file with all the other documents Karen would eventually wish she'd never created. She'd typed it officially on what looked like official HOA letterhead, though I later discovered she'd created the letterhead herself in Microsoft Word. The letter claimed that Karen had discovered errors in her original architectural approval and was now retroactively declaring my construction project in violation of HOA standards. More absurdly, she'd dated the violation notice as August 19th, 3 days before my permitted construction began. She demanded I halt all work immediately or face daily fines of $250, which she claimed would continue until architectural harmony is restored. I called the county building inspector that afternoon, Ed Morrison, a man I'd met briefly when submitting my original permits. He was bewildered by Karen's assertion. "Colonel," he said in his upstate drawl, "I reviewed those plans myself. They're perfect. Everything's up to code. That deck position is standard. The color palette is fine. The windows are fine. There's literally nothing wrong with this project." He offered to send me a formal written confirmation stating exactly that, which he did 3 days later. Armed with that documentation, I responded to Karen professionally but firmly, requesting a formal meeting with the entire HOA board to discuss the alleged violations. I specified that I would be bringing the county inspector's letter, my architect's certifications, the original approved plans, and Karen's own written approval note. Karen responded by calling my contractor and verbally telling him that she was authorized to fine him $500 per day for continued work on my property. Marcus called me, genuinely concerned. "Colonel, I appreciate the work, but I can't afford her fines if she's an HOA president with that authority. I need to know this is solid before I continue." That's when I started documenting everything systematically. I was trained in evidence collection and proper chain of custody procedures from my military background, and I applied those same principles here. I set up a camera that recorded the property entrance and installed a doorbell camera that captured anyone approaching my home. I began recording all my phone conversations with Karen. New York is a 2-party consent state, so I informed her each time that I was recording. I created a detailed timeline with dates, times, and descriptions of every interaction. I photographed all the project permits, Karen's approval letter, and the county inspector's certification. By September 3rd, I'd accumulated 47 pages of documentation in a properly organized 3-ring binder with tabs and cross-references. Karen, meanwhile, became increasingly erratic. She appeared at my property unannounced 3 times within a 2-week period, each visit photographed by my cameras. On September 7th, she sent another certified letter claiming that the construction puts the entire community at financial risk, and threatening me personally with legal action for $15,000 in alleged property value damages to neighboring homes. I consulted with Robert Hastings, an attorney from Syracuse who specialized in HOA disputes, that afternoon. Robert was direct. She's beyond the scope of her authority. She approved this project. She can't retroactively unapprove it. She can't fine you under pretense when the county has cleared everything. This is abuse of power, and her threats of personal litigation are unsupported. Then came September 14th, which I now refer to as the turning point where Karen's stupidity became criminal evidence. She showed up at the property at 8 in the morning while construction was actively happening. She had her phone out, photographing everything furiously, but she didn't just photograph the construction. She walked directly onto my property, trespassing, legally speaking, and photographed the workers, the materials, and the site plans that were laying on a table. Later that day, she circulated an email to all Meadowbrook Heights residents, attaching photographs of my construction site with this message. Dear neighbors, I regret to inform you that one of our community members has undertaken unpermitted construction in direct violation of HOA architectural standards. This delinquent resident's actions put all of our property values at risk and represent a flagrant disregard for our community standards. I am taking aggressive action to ensure our neighborhood's integrity is protected. Signed, Karen Mitchell, HOA President. I received calls from 3 different neighbors that afternoon, confused and concerned. One, an elderly woman named Patricia, who lived 2 doors down, called me directly and said, "Colonel, that woman's email frightened me half to death. But I looked out my window and your work looks fine. What's going on?" I explained the situation carefully and promised her the situation would be resolved. Then I called my attorney back. "She's defamed me publicly," I told Robert. "She's lied about permits. She sent threatening communications. What are my options?" That evening, Robert outlined a strategy. "We document everything, we maintain your composure, and we wait for her next mistake. She'll make another one. People like this always do. And when she does, we have her Robert's prediction proved accurate, but the evidence I discovered went much deeper than anyone anticipated. By mid-September, I'd hired a forensic accountant named David Chen to audit the HOA financial records, which are public documents that any resident can request. The normal HOA budget showed roughly $800 in monthly operational expenses, road maintenance, and community center utilities. That aligned with the $420 annual fees multiplied across approximately 30 households with additional revenue from occasional violation fines. But what David discovered was shocking. There were 2 separate financial accounts in HOA records. The official account showed all the legitimate expenses and income. The second account, which Karen had titled the Community Enhancement Initiative Fund, showed deposits totaling $4,700 over 18 months, all dating to whenever Karen had issued violation fines to various neighbors. What was particularly criminal was that this money had never been reported in official HOA financial statements or presented to the board during quarterly reviews. David did further research and discovered that the check for $1,200, allegedly a violation fine issued to a neighbor named Gerald Thompson for unauthorized landscaping, had been deposited into an account that traced back to Karen's personal checking account at the same bank. I provided all of this information to Robert, whose eyes widened as he reviewed the documents. "This is embezzlement," he said simply. "This is straight-up embezzlement of HOA funds. Do you understand what you've just uncovered?" I did understand, and I was actually stunned. I'd come into this situation wanting to stop her construction harassment and get my building project approved. I hadn't expected to discover financial crimes. Robert immediately advised me to file a formal complaint with the County District Attorney's Office, which I did on September 22nd, providing David's audit, copies of the financial records, check images, and a detailed timeline of the violations Karen had issued to various neighbors. I also discovered something else during this period. Karen had approved her own deck addition the previous year without submitting it to the board for formal vote or architectural review. I'd looked at the architectural guidelines she'd created as president, and they explicitly stated that all modifications required board approval with documented voting records. Her own deck? No documentation whatsoever. It was approved by Karen. For Karen, with no paper trail and no board involvement, I also began reaching out to neighbors to understand whether Karen's behavior toward me was unusual or part of a pattern. What I learned was disturbing. Gerald Thompson, the neighbor who'd allegedly violated landscaping standards, told me he'd installed 3 small flowering shrubs along his front walkway. Karen had issued him a violation fine of $1,200 for unauthorized modifications to landscape architecture, which wasn't even mentioned in the original architectural guidelines. He'd paid it, then looked back and realized the guidelines didn't actually prohibit what he'd done. Another neighbor, Susan Martinez, had received a violation notice for excessive vehicle parking when she'd simply had a contractor's truck parked in her driveway during work. That fine was $800. Every single person I spoke with had paid these fines without questioning them because Karen held the official position and seemed authoritative. None of them realized these fines weren't being reported or that Karen might be keeping the money. I consulted with a different attorney who specialized in HOA law, James Brenner, just to get a second opinion. He reviewed all my documentation and said, "You have a rock-solid civil case for abuse of authority, defamation, and tortious interference. But more importantly, you have evidence of embezzlement that's a matter for law enforcement." By the last week of September, I'd assembled a complete binder with organized sections: financial evidence, email communications, photographic documentation, video recordings from my cameras, attorney letters, and statements from affected neighbors. I had everything I needed. My plan was simple. I would file a formal complaint with law enforcement, provide them with the comprehensive documentation, and allow the proper authorities to conduct their investigation. I wasn't interested in revenge or public humiliation. I was interested in accountability and resolving this situation through legitimate channels. By the first week of October, I'd filed 3 formal legal documents: a complaint with the County District Attorney's Office regarding embezzlement, a civil lawsuit against Karen personally for abuse of authority and defamation seeking $75,000 in damages, and a formal request to the HOA board demanding an independent financial audit of all accounts during Karen's tenure as president. I also stopped being passive about my construction project. I retained a certified land surveyor to place official survey stakes marking my property boundaries with exact precision, making it absolutely clear that my deck was 8 feet from the property line, not 3 feet as Karen claimed. I had the surveyor create a formal certification document that I provided to the county building inspector, to my attorney, and to my title insurance company. On October 3rd, Karen sent me what would become her fatal mistake: a certified letter stating that she was prepared to pursue legal action against you personally for $15,000 in damages to neighborhood property values caused by your unauthorized construction project. She also attached photographs she'd taken and claimed they showed violations of community architectural standards. I sent that letter directly to my attorney, who reviewed it carefully. "This is incredible," James told me over the phone. "She's making a specific claim of financial damages. She's claiming your legal, permitted, county-approved construction is causing documented harm to property values. That's a false statement she's willing to pursue in court. That's exactly what we need." I also implemented something Karen never anticipated. I reached out to the county building inspector and formally requested that he conduct a compliance inspection of all properties in Meadowbrook Heights to ensure everyone was following the same architectural standards that Karen was now claiming I'd violated. Ed Morrison found this amusing. "You want me to inspect every property and verify they're all in compliance with their own HOA rules?" I explained that I simply wanted consistency and fairness in code enforcement, especially after Karen had alleged violations so seriously that she was threatening legal action. Ed agreed and scheduled inspections for mid-October. What happened next was delicious. Ed inspected Karen's own property on October 12th and discovered her deck addition had never been submitted for HOA architectural review. He also examined her front landscape and found 2 flowering trees that weren't listed in the approved materials for her landscaping. Under Karen's own standards, she'd violated community guidelines. Ed sent her a letter documenting these findings, marked for HOA board review. He also inspected the properties of the neighbors she'd fined. Gerald Thompson's flowering shrubs were completely compliant with acceptable landscape modifications, and Susan Martinez's temporary contractor parking was entirely legal and didn't violate any documented guidelines. Ed sent detailed letters to each of them explaining that their violations had been incorrectly issued and were not in compliance with county codes or HOA architectural standards. The building inspector's office doesn't issue refunds for fines, but he documented everything clearly for potential legal proceedings. On October 18th, the district attorney's office called me to confirm they were opening a formal investigation into the HOA financial records. They wanted to subpoena the bank records directly and wanted my cooperation as a complainant. I provided them with everything. That same week, I requested an emergency HOA board meeting to discuss what I termed structural governance issues. Karen couldn't refuse the request. It was a right available to any resident under the HOA bylaws. The meeting was scheduled for October 25th. I also began recording a video message explaining my situation, organizing all my documentation in an easily referenced format, and preparing my presentation materials. I created a timeline on poster board showing every incident, every date, every communication, and every piece of evidence. I organized the financial documents into clear spreadsheets showing the two separate accounts, the deposits that didn't match official reports, and the discrepancies in Karen's filings. I had my surveyor's certification ready. I had the county building inspector's letter ready. I had my attorney's analysis ready. I had the neighbors' statements ready. Everything was prepared, organized, and professional. Karen, meanwhile, continued as if nothing was happening. She sent another email to the HOA community on October 22nd, warning about architectural delinquents and promising continued enforcement. She had no idea that the district attorney was examining her financial records, that her civil lawsuit was being prepared by two attorneys, that the county building inspector had documented her own violations, or that I'd been documenting every action she'd taken for the past 2 months. The trap wasn't just set, it was baited and waiting for her to walk directly into it. The HOA emergency meeting on October 25th was held in the community center at 7 p.m. on a Thursday evening. Karen arrived early, as she usually did, and she looked completely confident. She had a folder of documents, presumably prepared to argue against my construction project. She had no idea what was coming. The meeting room had about 20 residents present, more than usual for a standard board meeting, but not unusual for an emergency session where a resident had requested discussion time. I arrived 15 minutes early with my attorney, James Brenner, in tow. Karen's expression changed slightly when she saw him. "Are we having a legal matter discussed?" she asked, trying to sound casual, but unable to hide the nervous edge in her voice. I simply said, "Let's wait for everyone to arrive," and took a seat in the front row. The three other board members, Tom Richardson, a retired accountant, Susan Wesley, a nurse, and David Kim, who owned a small business, looked confused about the entire situation. Karen called the meeting to order at 7:10 p.m. and quickly moved through standard agenda items. Then she got to new business and opened her mouth to address what she clearly assumed would be a discussion of my construction violation. That's when I stood up and asked for the floor. "I'd like to present evidence of a serious governance issue that requires immediate board attention and potential law enforcement referral," I said formally. I could see Karen's jaw tighten. I spent the next 20 minutes presenting my case. I showed the two separate HOA financial accounts, the forged letterhead she'd created, the violation fines that had never been reported in official records, the check images tracing to her personal bank account, and the financial audit David Chen had completed. I displayed the survey documentation proving my construction was legally placed. I showed Ed Morrison's building inspection reports proving that Karen's own property had violations, but that my construction had none. I presented the county building inspector's letter explicitly stating my project was 100% compliant with all local, state, and federal codes. Tom Richardson, the retired accountant, looked physically ill as he reviewed the financial documents. "Karen, can you explain these separate deposits?" he asked quietly. Karen's face had gone pale. "Those are community enhancement funds that we discussed at a board meeting last year," she stammered, but Tom immediately shook his head. "No, they weren't. I have records of every board meeting for 3 years. This was never discussed in any official capacity." I then presented statements from Gerald Thompson and Susan Martinez explaining the fines they'd received under Karen's authority, which I'd transcribed and had them sign. Gerald was actually at the meeting and stood to confirm that his landscaping was appropriate and that Karen's claim of violations was false. That's when I delivered the final piece of evidence. I played a recording of my phone conversation with Karen from September 10th, in which she explicitly threatened me with personal legal action for $15,000. In the recording, her tone was aggressive, and she made several statements that clearly constituted harassment under New York law, including, "I'll destroy you financially if you don't stop this construction," and "You'll regret ever moving to this community, Colonel. I promise you that." The room went completely silent. Karen stood up abruptly, her face red. "This is entrapment," she said loudly. "You recorded me without permission." I calmly explained that New York law required only that one party to the conversation know they were being recorded, and she'd been informed at the beginning of the call. James stepped forward then and handed formal copies of my civil lawsuit to Karen, to the board, and to the HOA's legal insurance carrier. "My client is suing you personally for abuse of authority, defamation, tortious interference with construction, and intentional infliction of emotional distress, seeking $75,000 in damages. Additionally, Mr. Chen's audit has been provided to the district attorney's office, and they are conducting a criminal investigation into the alleged embezzlement of HOA funds." Karen's face went from red to absolutely white. "I want my attorney present," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Tom Richardson, now clearly in charge, turned to her directly. "Karen, effective immediately, you are suspended from all board duties pending the outcome of the district attorney's investigation. We are demanding your resignation as HOA president, or we will commence removal proceedings. We're also requesting an independent forensic audit of all HOA finances and operations during your tenure." Susan Wesley, the nurse, added, "I move that we immediately dissolve the two-account system and consolidate all HOA finances into a single transparent account with quarterly reporting to all residents." David Kim seconded the motion, and it passed 3-0 with Karen abstaining. I didn't say anything else. I simply gathered my documentation, nodded at my attorney, and watched as Karen realized her entire world had just collapsed in front of 20 neighbors and the entire HOA board. The days and weeks following that October 25th meeting moved quickly but deliberately through the proper legal and administrative channels. On October 26th, Karen submitted her resignation as HOA president, effective immediately. She didn't provide an explanation. She just sent a one-sentence email stating she was stepping down. Tom Richardson assumed the interim presidency and immediately began damage control and proper governance procedures. The district attorney's office completed their preliminary investigation by November 8th and filed charges against Karen Mitchell, embezzlement of HOA funds totaling $12,300, filing false financial reports with the HOA board, and abuse of authority under New York general business law. The charges were serious, and Karen was required to surrender to county booking on November 10th for processing. She was released on her own recognizance with a court date set for December 3rd. Her attorney negotiated a plea agreement by mid-December, and Karen agreed to plead guilty to embezzlement and filing false reports in exchange for prosecutors dropping the abuse of authority charge. She was sentenced on January 15th to 18 months in county jail, not federal prison, but still time, with 3 years of probation, mandatory restitution of $12,300 to the HOA, and prohibition from serving on any HOA board or similar community organization for a period of 10 years. Additionally, she was ordered to pay my legal fees, which totaled $7,800. My civil lawsuit was settled in February when Karen's homeowner's insurance agreed to a settlement of $32,000, citing her abuse of authority and the documented harassment. She personally paid the remainder of my lawsuit demand from her savings. By March, Karen had listed her house for sale. She'd lived in the Meadowbrook Heights community for only 4 years, and she was leaving in disgrace. The HOA itself underwent significant changes. Tom Richardson and the board commissioned a complete governance review, implemented new financial controls requiring dual signatures on any expenditures over $100, established quarterly resident financial reporting, and created a formal appeals process for any violations or fines. They also hired a professional HOA management company to handle day-to-day operations, something they'd never done before. The 23 violations that Karen had issued during her tenure were reviewed individually, and 18 of them were formally rescinded as unsupported by actual architectural guidelines. 7 residents received refunds or credits totaling $4,200 because Karen had overcharged them or issued duplicate fines for the same incidents. The community held a new election in April, and Tom Richardson was elected president by a large margin. The first act of the new board was to apologize to the residents for Karen's abusive governance and to commit to transparent, fair administration going forward. My construction project was completed without further incident in January, and Margaret and I moved into the new master suite in February. We hosted a small celebration for the contractors and a few neighbors who'd been affected by Karen's harassment. It felt like a weight had lifted. Karen sold her house for $267,000 in April, about $35,000 less than comparable homes in the area were selling for at the time, likely because her legal situation became known in the community. She relocated to Florida to live with her daughter, according to what we learned through neighborhood gossip. Delaney Financial Services, her employer, where she worked as a compliance manager, had terminated her employment in November when the financial crimes became public. She'd earned $94,000 annually there, and she wasn't able to secure comparable employment in Florida due to her criminal record. My original county permits remain valid, and the addition has been completed to exact specifications. The county building inspector, Ed Morrison, actually stopped by one afternoon in May and walked through the completed project. "Perfect work," he said. "Karen would have hated it, which means it must be exactly right." I still have all the documentation in an organized binder. The original plans, the approval letters, the survey certifications, the county inspection reports, the audio recordings, the financial audits, and the legal filings. It represents not just the successful completion of a home improvement project, but the accountability of someone who abused power and victimized her community. Margaret loves her new sitting room with the windows overlooking our property. She reads there most afternoons and watches the birds, exactly as she'd imagined during those long military deployments. The whole situation, from Karen's first interference in August to her sentencing in January, took exactly 5 months. It was methodical, documented, and thorough. I've learned that sometimes the best response to someone wielding power illegally is not confrontation, but careful documentation of the truth. Karen thought her position as HOA president made her untouchable. She was wrong. The system of laws that protects property owners protects them equally. What I'm most satisfied about is that we didn't just resolve my problem, we reformed an entire HOA's governance structure and protected future residents from similar abuse. My construction project was the catalyst, but the real victory was accountability. Thanks so much for watching. Let me know in the comments where you're watching from. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell. See you in the next episode.